Chapter 11: The Birth of a New Religion. The Big Question. How did Muhammad become one of the most influential religious leaders of the time? No one present at Muhammad's birth could have guessed his future. He had an inauspicious beginning. Although he belonged to the tribe that ruled the town of Mecca and looked after its shrine, Muhammad's father died before he was born. In the 6th century in Arabia, your father's death meant you were legally an orphan and your position in society was not secure. How did an orphan born in a remote part of Arabia become one of the most influential religious figures of all time? How did a boy in the desert grow to found a new religion and a mighty empire? Life among the Bedouins. While still a baby, Muhammad was sent by his mother to be nursed and raised, as was traditional for infants in Mecca, in the desert among the Bedouins. Removing a child from its mother may seem cruel, but at the time it was actually a way of keeping babies safe. Illness was more common in crowded towns, and if babies became ill, there was no modern medicine to cure them. The desert was healthier. Life for Bedouins was difficult and dangerous. Finding enough water in the desert to survive was a constant struggle, and there were barely enough crops and cattle to feed everyone. From a very young age, Muhammad worked for his foster family. As a boy, he would have tended to the camels, taking them to the well to drink, and watching out for hyenas and other predators. At night in the desert, the sky is very clear and the temperature plummets. In the freezing air under the star, the men of the tribe would recite long oral poems, stories of battles won, of grand adventures, of loves gained and loves lost. Hours-long poems were recited by heart. The Bedouins valued honor, bravery, and survival in the face of hardship. Their tales were full of these values, and Muhammad would have absorbed how to survive. Back in Mecca, at 5, was taken from his Bedouin foster family, the only family he had ever known, and returned to Mecca and his mother. Imagine how strange the city must have seemed after the empty desert. People bustling through the streets, merchants shouting about their wares, rich and poor living side by side. Just a year after Muhammad returned to Mecca, his mother died. He then lived with his elderly grandfather, the head of the tribe, until he also died just 2 years later. In his first 8 years of life, Muhammad had lost both parents, had been taken away from his foster family, and had then lived with his grandfather only for him too to die. This was a time when death and disease were common, but even so, Muhammad had a tragic childhood. These losses may have made Muhammad particularly sensitive to the least powerful in society. He later preached that it was very important to help the most vulnerable, including orphans. Fortunately, Muhammad's uncle Abu Talib, the new head of the tribe, took him in. From the age of 8, Muhammad worked looking after the camels traveling along Mecca's trade roads. These trade roads were very dangerous. It was while traveling along them that Muhammad's father had died. The desert was scorching in the day and freezing at night. Most people walked for hundreds of miles, as camels were needed to carry the goods. During the day, they had to watch for raiders who would attack caravans and leave the people to die. At night, people took turns keeping watch for wolves, hyenas, or thieves attempting to steal the camels. Muhammad rose from being humble camel boy to a merchant and his uncle's closest advisor. He earned a reputation for integrity. As a young man, Muhammad caught the eye of a wealthy widow and successful merchant named Khadija, who asked Muhammad to marry her. Muhammad agreed, and they are said to have had a very happy and successful marriage resulting in several children. The Revelations. Muhammad lived quietly and peacefully for many years, busy with his business and his family. He was a thoughtful man, and sometimes he would leave the city for several days for the peace and solitude of the mountains. It was one of these trips in approximately 610, when Muhammad was around 40 years old, that Muslims believe that he had his first vision of the angel Gabriel. Muhammad heard Gabriel commanding him to recite a verse that would later become part of the Quran, the main religious text of Islam. The Quran and the Hadith. The Quran, the recitation, contains the message Muhammad believed he heard from God through the angel Gabriel over a period of 23 years, and which were written down by scribes and memorized by others during his lifetime. It consists of 114 surahs or chapters and is one of the authoritative sources on what Muslims should believe and how they should behave. In addition to the Quran, Muslims found the Hadith, a collection of reports on the teachings, deeds, and sayings of Muhammad and his close companions that was compiled after his death. One of Hadith summarizes what are generally called the 5 pillars of Islam. Shahada, the belief in one God, and Muhammad as his prophet. Salat, prayer 5 times a day. Zakat, giving a portion of one's income to the poor and needy. Psalm, fasting during Ramadan, the 9th month of the Islamic calendar. Hajj, pilgrimage to Mecca once in a lifetime. The Quran. Up until this moment, Muhammad had been a polytheist, but through his vision, he came to believe there is only one God, the God of Abraham, who is worshipped by Jews and Christians. At first, Muhammad was terrified by his experiences. He first told only his wife, Khadija, who comforted him and believed him. Then he shared what he had seen and heard with some of his closest relatives and friends, who also believed what he was saying. In 613, Muhammad started publicly preaching his message. Muhammad continued to have visions or revelations throughout his life. They were collected after his death and together formed the Quran. Muslims believe that the revelations in the Quran came from God, just as Jews believe that the Torah, their own holy book, is from God. Muslims see Muhammad as the last prophet, someone who speaks the will of God, following Moses, Jesus, and others. Medina and the growth of Islam. Some welcomed Muhammad's message, particularly the less powerful and wealthy of Mecca. But for Muhammad's own tribe, the Quraysh, it was blasphemy. The Quraysh, who worshipped additional gods, did not like being told that their religion was wrong. They made life very difficult for Muhammad, particularly after his uncle Abu Talib and wife both died in 619. The next 3 years were a constant struggle for the first followers of Muhammad, the first Muslim. They were facing violent persecution in Mecca. Their future looked bleak. Some sought refuge in the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia. Neighboring towns were beginning to hear about Muhammad's message and his reputation for honesty. In 622, the people of Yathrib, a town about 250 miles north of Mecca, invited him to become their arbiter and in many ways the ruler of the town. Muhammad agreed. He moved there that same year in 622, and this became known as the first official year of the Islamic era, the year of Hijra calendar. Yathrib was renamed Medina al-Nabi, which means the prophet's city, Medina for short. The Abrahamic religions. Muhammad came to believe that the God he heard through Gabriel was the God of Abraham, also worshipped by Jews and Christians. Muslims call that God Allah. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are sometimes called the Abrahamic faith because they all trace their origin to Abraham, believed by Muslims, Jews, and Christians to be God's first prophet. Followers of the Abrahamic faith believe many of the same things and follow many of the same practices. For example, all three religions are monotheistic, the belief in only one God. All three religions have holy scriptures that are believed to reveal the Word of God: the Quran for Islam, the Torah for Jews, and the Old and New Testament for Christians, as well as additional guides for living in the Hadith for Islam and in the Talmud for Jews. The guidelines about food in Islam, halal, have similarities to the guidance about food in Judaism, kashrut. Religion and politics. In the United States, the First Amendment of the Constitution prohibits the establishment of an official religion. This is sometimes called the separation of church and state. For example, government funds cannot be used to benefit or advance the interests of a particular religion. But for the Islamic and European dynasties of the Middle Ages, religion and government were not separate. Wars were often fought in the name of religion, and religious figures often had political and military authority. You cannot truly understand Muhammad's life or what happened after his death without remembering this. You also cannot understand the Crusades or life in the Middle Ages without understanding the relationship between religion and government. Muhammad's move to Medina as a ruler meant that for the first time, Muslims had political power, as they would continue to have to the present day. Over the following 12 years, Muhammad's reach grew rapidly. He used three tactics. He preached, winning many new believers. He conducted raids on nearby towns that fought him and his caravans as well. And he made deals with important people, additionally offering wealth to towns willing to join his community of believers. But while his influence grew, he continued to struggle with the people of his own town, Mecca. Many Meccans refused to acknowledge Muhammad as a true prophet. By 638 years after leaving Mecca, Muhammad had converted thousands of people to Islam. He was able to march to Mecca with a force of 10,000 men. When Mecca surrendered to Muhammad, he pardoned his enemies and gave them many important positions. By doing this, Muhammad showed his political wisdom. He knew that if he had humiliated the Quraysh, they would have hated and tried to destroy him. By offering peace and power, he instead made them his allies. Once Muhammad had gained control of Mecca, he quickly used his expanding political and military power to expand Islam. By the time of his death in Medina in 632 CE, all of Western Arabia was under his control, and a huge number of people had converted to Islam. This was the first time that the region had been united by religion or politics. It had happened amazing fast, just 2 years after Muhammad had conquered Mecca. A map of Islam's expansion under Muhammad. A well-known Persian guide to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Kaaba, the Cube, was a famous shrine in Mecca that Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh, looked after and where its members worshipped their gods. It is an ancient stone structure that Muslims believe was originally built by Abraham. When Muhammad returned to Mecca in 630, he destroyed all of the idols in the Kaaba and made it a place of worship for Muslims. Today, it is inside the Grand Mosque, the center of the Muslim world. When Muhammad returned to claim Mecca, most of the people there chose to convert to Islam. In 632 CE, just before his death, Muhammad called on his followers to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. More than 100,000 people joined him. Since then, there has been a pilgrimage every year to Mecca, the Hajj. Going on this pilgrimage is one of the 5 pillars of Islam for those who can afford it. Over 2 million people now travel to Mecca every year for the pilgrimage, and as many visit it outside of the Hajj season. Muhammad's legacy. In 632, just before he died, Muhammad went on pilgrimage from Medina to Mecca. On the way back to Medina, he stopped and gave a sermon to his followers. He told them he was about to die and that they must continue to follow the Quran. But who would succeed Muhammad? There was no unified view. And Muhammad's own words arguably did not make this clear. In his final sermon, he had talked about his son-in-law, Ali. Therefore, some of Muhammad's followers believed he had intended for Ali to lead the Muslims after his death. Others who heard the same words, however, felt that Muhammad had not intended for Ali to be the new leader, but was intended merely using him as an example of an important and faithful Muslim. As you will discover later, this disagreement was very important in Islam's history. The ambiguity over the role of Ali caused a lot of discord among the new Muslims, even as they continued to expand and conquer. Eventually, this led to the formation of two different branches of Islam, the Shia and the Sunni. Muhammad left a great legacy. He overcame many challenges as a young boy and became the most important religious and political leader in Arabia. It was in many ways his continued influence after his death that was most extraordinary. Worshippers at the Kaaba in Mecca.